Hello, everyone. We may still have some folks trickling in, and we have others joining us on Facebook. My name is Marcella Paris, and I am the director of the Lewiston Public Library. I would like to welcome you all to tonight's evening program, Subverted Authorities. Those on Zoom will see a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. You can use this to enter any questions for our speakers, and they will answer these towards the end of the program. And for those who are joining us on Facebook Live, go ahead and type your questions into the comment box there, and we'll make sure that they get to our speakers. And now, our speakers. Claire Guyton has been a Maine Arts Commission Literary Fellow and twice a finalist for the Maine Literary Award, and her work has been selected for the Best Small Fictions Anthology and nominated for a pushcart. Her short fiction appears in numerous journals, as well as in the Maine anthology Summer Stories. She is the co-founder and co-editor of Water Wheel Review and the co-founder and co-organizer of the local reading series, Local Writers Read. Claire works in interlibrary loan and lives in a pumpkin-colored house with her husband and two queenly sister cats. Jefferson Navicky is the author of Antique Densities, Modern Parables, and Other Experiments in Short Prose, as well as the poetic novel, The Book of Transparencies, and the story collection, The Paper Coast. He has been awarded a Maine Arts Commission grant, 2 Maine Literary Awards, and was the 2019 winner of the Maine Postmark Poetry Contest. He is the archivist for the Maine Women Writers Collection and lives in Freeport with his wife, dog, cats, and chickens. And so, without further ado, please welcome Claire and Jefferson.
Thank you, Marcella. It's great to get this chance to talk writing with Jefferson, and no better way to do it than through my beloved Lewiston Public Library. And thank you to Jefferson for inviting me to help you celebrate the release of your latest book. I have it right here. As we mentioned, Antique Densities. I know you're going to talk a little bit about what inspired you to write it and what you're trying to do with it, but I'll just say that I read this book the way I run my hands over an old, much-loved quilt. The voice is layered and textured and feels like it's coming from an earlier time to sort out and meditate on the surprising state we find ourselves in. What I enjoy about it most, as you can guess, because it's the reason I'm here tonight, is the way you glory in and show off the joys of very short prose. You know I love your poetry, but I connect very deeply with these prose pieces. We're talking about them as hybrid in form because they live in this overlap space between prose poems and micro or flash prose, in our case, micro or flash fiction. But I enjoy them so much because I love writing this form myself, and I love studying it and figuring out what we can accomplish with it. So again, thank you for this book and for this conversation.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks a lot for being here to talk about these pieces with me in the book, and especially to the Lewiston Public Library and Marcella for hosting. And I just wanted to say that when I kind of dreamed up this idea, the main reason was that I really admire Claire's writing. So that was the first thing. And then we both are, as she mentioned, we write these pieces that are somewhere between short fiction, short stories, and like line break poetry. So it'd be interesting to get together and talk about it. So I suppose we should talk about our title, Subverted Authorities. So I'll pass it back to Claire to do that and to get ready for her reading.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'll take a moment to explain ourselves. I mentioned what we mean by hybrid. The pieces we're reading tonight live somewhere between prose poetry and very short fiction. But we haven't talked yet about what we mean by subverted authorities. When we talked about what this conversation might look like, we landed on the word subversion pretty quickly. I brought it up in reference to a kind of short story that I enjoy writing and that I think eventually led me to this kind of hybrid short prose. So I'll explain that first. I mentioned something I call a subverted form story, which is a short story that takes on an established narrative form, like a product label or a self-help brochure or a questionnaire. and it subverts the language of the form to begin to wring story out of it, and then to build on that story, to pack a punch by the end of it, like any other story does. So doing something that experimental with a story is much easier to do if you keep the total word count low, because that conceit, that kind of playful trick, is going to wear on the patience of the reader if it goes on too long. So when I first got really serious about writing, I studied and wrote a lot of subverted form stories. And I think that's where I developed this strong taste for challenging readers' expectations. I also became entranced with the idea of accomplishing serious story satisfaction in fewer and fewer words. A very short fiction, say 300 to 500 words, which is a common range for microfiction, and it's what I'm going to read tonight, is too short for a subverted form. And of course, it's too short to employ the usual strategies of more traditional length short stories. But it turns out that playing with the subverted form stories was really good practice for taking on very short fiction. So now I'm coming to why we're talking about subverted authorities tonight. So often I find the satisfaction of a very short piece comes from subverting the narrative authority of the piece, which is just kind of another way of saying challenging the expectations of the reader. In a 300-word story, for example, you can subvert the authority of the narrative with a 1 or 2 line ending that does something new that the reader wasn't expecting. I think you use the same kind of approach, Jefferson, quite a lot in this book, albeit, a little bit differently from how I'm doing it in these 2 pieces that I'm going to read. And we'll talk a lot about that, I hope, when you do your reading, how you manage to subvert these authorities or these expectations. Okay, so I'm going to read 2 stories I wrote when I took on the project of writing a story every day for a year so that I could master very short fiction. I wanted to know how to write a satisfying micro or flash. Micros are usually 300 to 500 words. Flashes are usually 500 to 1200 words. That daily practice, I wasn't allowed to go to bed unless I had figured out a way to end the story I started that day, taught me how to do it. And again, I found that this kind of subtle subversion of expectations was a great way often to get myself to a satisfying ending so I could go to bed, which sometimes didn't happen until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. So the first piece is called 3 Things, and it was published by Mid-American Review. 3 things. She left 3 things behind. The rings, I understand, on a scarlet dinner napkin from the set we used for Christmas, when she folded the fabric to look like poinsettias, each rising from the center of a bone white plate. Now just this one flat square of cloth, blood against the rings, laid at her place at the table. The diamond glitters in the low light of sunset. The plain gold band hardly looks like it would fit a finger, molded as it is to the shape of an egg, so thin at the pointy bottom. And I get why she left the shoes. I splurged years ago for her birthday, Italian leather, hand-stitched, heels impossibly high. For Valentine's Day, on our anniversary, any big day, wearing those shoes was shorthand for romance. She'd parked them on the lid of the recycling bin. One had fallen over, the strap splayed out like a lolling tongue. Here's what I don't get. Her umbrella, open of all things, and hung upside down by its strap from the light fixture in the center of the living room. It will never rain where I'm going. Is that what she's trying to say? Is it a reference to the old saw that an umbrella opened indoors brings bad luck, and that the worst, blackest luck is what she wants for me? Or is this simply a last whimsical act as conductor? Up, she says, with her stick, up here and hold, hold. Stare, she says, train your baffled eyes on this ridiculous object, at the curved spines and taut purple fabric, this useless tinted bowl. Like a good boy, always the good boy, I do. I stare, my neck beginning to cramp, my eyes blurring, until I run out of the air holding this note of her absence. I will be unable to walk away from the shadow this thing casts, and yet equally unable to reach out, take hold of it, and pull it down. Pull it down? But why? Like an open flower, isn't it? Collecting at its center a small silk petal piece.
Thanks, Claire. And for everybody listening at home, that final piece is a piece like War and Peace. Man, that umbrella at the end of that piece, when I hear that, and it has this kind of what the ring and the shoes sort of make sense, and then you hit the umbrella, and you're like, what is going on with this umbrella? And like, where did it come from? I mean, that was, if there was a question that if I was going to ask you, I was kind of like, did you land on the umbrella as like the start of the piece, or like, how did that umbrella come to? It's such a kind of strange but oddly striking image there.
So I wrote that piece so many years ago that I'm not completely sure, but what I think I remember, I remember. So I was writing, I got the image of the rings first, and then that made me think about someone leaving somebody. So I started writing out that concrete scene. And then I just got to a place where I wanted him to see something strange that he couldn't explain. And I don't know where the idea of the umbrella came from, but I thought, wouldn't it be funny if somebody hung an umbrella up, kind of like an ornament, because it would just be so strange and you wouldn't know what on earth to think of it if you walked in your house and you saw that. So I have no idea how I got the idea of that, but I know that I just wanted to do something odd. And then when I wrote the ending, I just kept writing, and it just occurred to me that I wanted him to turn it upside down. I just wanted him to go from being sad and mourning to finding it inspirational to have this weird thing hanging from his ceiling.
Well, that's the feeling that I got. Like somehow the umbrella was almost the thing that allowed him to feel hopeful by the end. Like there was so much sadness in the ring and the shoes, and then all of a sudden this strange object like lets in all this possibility that there was no feeling of happiness really until you get to the end, and then there's this sense of, and happiness, maybe not the right word, but peace. Like there's almost like, and it just kind of opens the question of, I wonder if that's what she was wanting him to get to, like that there was this sense of peace that, I'm going to put this really strange thing in the room to see if that's going to like trigger something to you. Because there's the communication between a couple that's going on in that piece is like very profound, but also like the kind of language that happens in couples that only two people could understand.
Wouldn't it be nice if she wants him to feel that peace? I don't think I felt that when I wrote it, but I'm one of those people who I'm totally happy with people to have different interpretations of the pieces that I write. It absolutely delights me, this notion that maybe she wants him to feel that peace. So thank you for that. And I'm also really excited that you found that you did find it hopeful, because I was going for that. I said I don't mind if people read my pieces differently, and of course I don't really, but it is exciting when you go for something and then somebody tells you that you actually landed it. So that's great. Thank you.
There's no kind of, but that piece is the Dear John letter, and without it like being written out as in like, these are the reasons and this is why I'm going, like it's like this kind of mystery match game. Like, okay, there's this I get, and then there's this, and then there's this, like I have no idea, like, and there's you can't like tie it to a certain part of a letter that's like, this is why, what she means. So
yeah, thank you. I never would have read it that way myself, I don't think, but that's great. But what I was going for sure was that turn. So I'm really glad that you got the turn, that you went from sad to so like, oh, hopeful. And that's what I was trying to do when I'm talking about subverting expectations in that piece. So thank you, Jefferson. All right, so now I will read a piece called Mountains. And this one was published by Connotations Press. Okay. Mountains. For almost a year, I'd been teaching at a school built into a bowl of land between two mountains. In the shadow of the rock, I hunched, pulled my elbows in tight. I scurried from building to building, wincing at the weight of what towered above. On a day when I wasn't just wincing, but dizzy, if I caught myself wanting to fling my body at all that hardness, to beat my fists on it, then I would plan an escape. As soon as possible, I would drive the winding road between the mountains, dragging long, shuddering breaths until the rock fell away and I could see sky in every direction. Of course, said my mother, you grew up on the coast. Your first breath came with the tang of salt. Your first view was of a vast expanse of flat. Of course you hate the mountains. I don't hate them, I said, warming my hands on a mug of tea, my eyes closed. No, she said, it's not as if the mountains have agency. It's not as if they're making you feel claustrophobic on purpose. My eyes popped open. The mountains have agency. They're making me feel claustrophobic on purpose. I drove back along the twisting blacktop, my hands too tight on the steering wheel. How do you fight a mountain? How do you combat its loom? Whenever I was outside, I kept my eyes on my feet. When I was inside, my back to the window. I spent a lot of time in my cabin with earplugs, trying not to hear and feel the mountain's vibrations. I dreamt about wielding a gigantic jackhammer. I fantasized about ping-ponging between the two faces of rock, scaling up and down with ease. I grew more pale. How do you fight a mountain? You sneak away to a hidden spot where honeysuckle snakes through a crack in the stone. You break out the chisel and sledgehammer, and you start chipping away, one flake at a time, the very crust of the earth. You scrape and splinter and pound and gouge. You insist that you are the permanent one.
What I was thinking of when you get to that end of that permanent one, I mean, I think that why I love this piece is that I'm not from the salty coast. I grew up in the Midwest, but I went to graduate school in Boulder, Colorado, right next to the mountains, and that there's that's how do you combat loom? Like there's a sense of like, I love how the piece is like literally like man versus nature, or like what can you do against a mountain and this like menacingness? And I wondered, like, is that how did you get that sense of the mountain? Did you live near mountains, or did you kind of grow up near mountains?
I grew up near mountains. I grew up in foothills in Virginia. So, at prom, we went up to the mountains, and, so I drove through mountains quite a bit, and I stayed in the mountains a few times. And also when I lived in North Carolina, I went to Asheville a few times. And I don't know, I just get that sense that mountains are just so enormous. When I'm near them, I'm so in awe of them. But they also, I don't think they do make me afraid, but that bit of fear that's in awe, I feel that. And I was just imagining one day what it would be like if you lived in one kind of landscape. Because like I said, I grew up in the foothills, but what if you live in a really flat landscape and then you're pushed into the mountains somehow? I don't know what made me think about mountains that day. Something made me think about mountains. And then I thought, well, what if you had to go from that one landscape to the other? And what if it just terrified you? Like, what if it just weighed on you and you just couldn't function? Because I have heard of people who have a really hard time if they, like, if you do grow up in the mountains and then you have to live somewhere really flat where you can just see, forever, that it can really freak people out, and they just literally cannot stay in that kind of landscape. So I was just exploring that idea. I have no idea what made me think about mountains, and I certainly have never experienced what this poor lady experiences in the story, but there's certainly, fear and awe that
Well,
it
and
felt.
what I think I love is that fear and all, which when living in the mountains, I felt that at times when I was living there, and like not exactly all the time, but there is that sense of fear. And what I appreciated in the piece is how it kind of took that fear and like turned it into agency, and was going to like fight back against the mountain, even if it's kind of like there's a Don Quixote against the windmills kind of sense, like it's hopeless, but it's like something to do, and that she's going to do it. And it's almost more poignant because it's so impossible, that this is something that she is committing to, even though, what is she ever going to do against a mountain?
So once again, you have added a layer, but it's interesting to me that I think you think of her as more, well, I shouldn't say that I don't think of her as sympathetic. I do. Of course I do. But like you see her as like being tough and brave and going after the mountain. And I just think, oh, you poor sweetheart, you are going to die, honey. You are. We all do. And you will too, but I love the idea that I should respect her more and think of her as tough. So thank you for that. Okay. Jefferson, I
Okay.
read my 2 pieces. I was the warm-up act. I wanted to make sure we have plenty of time now to hear your great work and get a chance to chat a little bit about it. So please take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you, Claire. It's fun to hear those pieces. It's really fun to talk about the pieces too. So I was just going to say a quick thing about kind of the genesis of these little prose pieces for me. I mentioned it in the introduction to the book, but it really came from when it was 1998 and I was 22 and I just graduated from college, and I was an English major in college. And I don't know if how other people, if they finish college and you feel like some sense of triumph and heading out into the world. And I did not feel that. I felt like I had not read anything and that I needed to read more things. And so that was the moment that I found this book. And it was, my brother had a internship in an art gallery in New York City in Soho. And it was one of those internships where they didn't pay you anything, but they gave you a really fancy lunch. So I visited him for a couple of days, and he was gracious enough to invite me for that lunch. So I had the lunch. I was feeling it was like one of those lunches where that was all we were going to eat for the rest of the day because we didn't have any money to do anything else. So we were just going to fill up on this lunch. So I was kind of maybe sated and kind of stumbling down West Broadway. And I went into this little bookstore, used bookstore, and I found Tales of Wisdom, this 100 parables edited by Howard Schwartz. And these pieces just totally blew my mind. All these little prose pieces, he calls them modern parables. I mean, I'm not exactly sure why he calls them that, but there is some kind of parabolic quality to them. And they just totally blew my mind. I didn't know that these kind of things were possible. And then so I copied all the names of the writers and the books that were in the bio notes at the end onto this little piece of paper, stuffed it in my wallet, and decided that I was just going to go to bookstores and find these books. And there was going to be my own little personal reading list. But I never found any of them. And maybe I found one Kafka, one Borges, and then there were like dozens of other ones I didn't find. And I looked everywhere and asked, couldn't find them. And I think there's that sense of like kind of failure in a sense of like, I couldn't find them, but I still want to like join them. So there's a kind of led me to maybe writing them, or at least trying to kind of join in dialogue with this book that I so loved. So I'm going to read the oldest piece in the book, which is called Parable of the Makers. And it's from, I finished graduate school in 2005. And so this was in the last semester of graduate school. And if for any writers, it was one of these workshop experiences where I brought it in, and the workshop the response was like lukewarm to sort of befuddled. And it was like the workshop had talked about it for quite a while and kind of picked it over, and like, 40% was helpful, 40% was not helpful, 20% was like, I don't know what to do with it. And so I kind of sat through this whole piece, and then my mentor at Naropa was named Banu Kapil, who's a writer I really admire and a person who I really admire. And she didn't say anything until the end, and then she just said, this is like, I don't think I've ever read a piece like this, and it's certainly not a piece that you've ever written. Like, this is a new piece. And she didn't say if she liked it or anything, but it was like, I could tell that she was interested in it. And like, that was enough to like inspire me. So I kept it in there for that reason. So Parable of the Makers, and has a epigraph from Michelle Auerbach, was a student at Naropa with me. You aren't the mightiest, only the most elegant. And this is a piece within a piece. So I'll tell you when it gets to the second part. In his desk, its old manual bulk lay unfashioned, a hearse ornamented with ribbon and gesture. He went to it, lay down bare, and watched his life float by. An errant moth in his palm, small, tattered, the color of unrelenting dust. This is what he wrote the moment he learned to touch. And this is the other piece. Lineage of a warrior. In a room with a glass ceiling patterned with rose petals, he cut off his slender fingers with an axe. There was an elevator in the house. Everyone had failed or was failing, going up and down. His was a leap like the end of solitude. At the table in the room, he studied all the methods of disappearance. 3,000 years ago, the angel of death passed over the home. Following tradition, he released that part of himself by candle and burnt blade. The idea of death as an angel, a warrior, workmanlike, with a thin sword and a leather sheath, shirt sleeves rolled, forearms rippling with tendons and muscle. He would remember the moment he made new limits, cut new time, his wrists ticking like a clock, the sweet blackness, the cold stars getting rid of the smell. And then it goes out of that and back into the original narrative. It made me feel like I was nothing, he said. And he touched the void, Starleak in a dark sky.
Okay, first, thank you for the word Starleak. That is just perfection. And second, I wish people could see the form of this one. So people, when they buy the book, they will see how it's set up with that short paragraph, and then you have the centerpiece. You have it set off, and it's in italics, and then you have what looks like a very small poem. So you look like you have a prose poem at the top, and almost like a journal entry or a letter. It almost looks like, and then you have like a little small 3-line verse at the bottom. And the reason I'm describing that is there's something about the way it looks on the page that appeals to that part of me that I talked about before, writing the subverted form stories, because it sets up a kind of expectation as you're going through it. And so I read it as though I was reading stages of something, and each thing was sort of doubling back on the other. And of course, 3 is one of those numbers. You love to have things in 3s. And then the language that you used in each piece, for me, it's just so clear that you're a poet. So this is one of there are multiple pieces. There's a handful of pieces in here that read completely like prose poems to me. And in this one, like that bottom one looks like a whole separate poem, and the top one looks like a prose poem. And then the middle one does not really look like a poem or feel like a poem, but the language is so poetic so for me, like, my reaction to that piece is all about the emotion that I get from it, and all about the way I take in the images. And that's the same way I read poetry, Whereas some of the other pieces, including the other two that you're going to read, I respond to those more like they're prose. So this piece really interests me because it screams hybrid so much. You know, it really gets to the things that we're talking about. Did you say that you never really tweaked it much? Is that pretty much the form that you wrote it in to begin with?
Yeah. Yep, that's pretty much it. Yeah, I mean there was a feeling of it felt just kind of special and strange to me, and I didn't want to like mess with it really.
Yeah, I think special and strange are great words for it. Do you find, so I have found that with these small pieces, for example, the two that I read tonight, I hardly touched after I wrote them, and I don't know, I've published maybe 25 or something of those short pieces that were around 300, 500 words, some of 750 some, in various magazines. And almost all of them I barely touched. There's something about this form. And I'm curious, since you're a poet, you can tell me whether it's like this with poetry. There's something about this form that sort of, once you get into the flow, once you catch the wave of whatever it is that you're trying to write and sort of pull out of yourself, it kind of lands on the page the way you want it. You have to barely touch it afterwards. Is that what you find too?
I mean, definitely sometimes. Yeah. I mean, I think that there is there's a lot of like thinking or like setting up that goes on before I actually start to write it. And then if that's kind of set up at least so enough that I can figure it out as I'm going along, then yeah, then there's not as much work. At least going back, I kind of like line editing it and changing little words and things, but like the whole general things.
Yeah, tiny bits of tweaking. There's something to, I think, when I wrote them, because I definitely did not have time to think it through because I was writing them every day. And there's something about the urgency, and there's something about how short they are, how, you know, you're push to the end. There's something about that I think makes you redouble as you're writing, just sort of constantly pushing towards the finish. And then that urgency, that refusal to stop and think too much, makes you go into interesting places, makes, you know, you take leaps that you wouldn't ordinarily take in a longer piece. I think that's what I found from writing stories. I think that's why it taught me how to write this kind of fiction, was that sense of urgency. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful piece. It's a great example of hybrid forms. And I really, really love, in particular, I love that that tiny little poem at the bottom with Starleak in it. It's so nice. But the whole thing, of course, it just really punches hard on the whole mortality thing. So I hope everyone is feeling secure out there.
Yeah. Okay, so I was going to hit the second one. It's called Practical Criticism, and it involved at least like a little bit of research, it was from a newspaper article that I read, and then I did a little bit of research. There's a practical criticism is a real thing, and I.A. Richards is the guy who founded it, and which is kind of interesting to me. And when I was reading, and I think what was most interesting to me was that in the piece, he seemed so knowledgeable and confident in all of this stuff about the canon of literature, and which is so much not my experience of like being knowledgeable and confident in that realm is just not my mode in the world. But I was interested in seeing that, and also kind of like trying to pick up the curtain beneath, like I wonder what's underneath that like confidence that is so portrayed. And then the other thing, like he gave his students all these kind of well-known pieces of literature and asked them to critique them. So I wanted to like do away with all those and put in the pieces of literature that I was reading and liked. So I kind of like remake the canon. So, I mean, some of this stuff is real and some of it is not real. So practical criticism. In his famous experiment, Practical Criticism, the Cambridge critic I.A. Richards gave his undergraduates a set of poems, withholding from them the titles and authors' names, and asked them to evaluate the poems. His students worked silently, methodically, as for an exam, but also with a noticeable excitement that displayed the barely controlled glee of passing judgment on those who had, in their minds, so frequently passed judgment upon them. Richards included in the pile of poems a sonnet by Shakespeare, which he knew would receive low marks for archaism. Coleridge's Kubla Khan, a small Dickinson, Creeley, Juna Barnes, Jean Toomer, Richard Brodigan, Meme Brussenbrugge, Anne Waldman, and a poem about elephants that walk with thunder his 7-year-old daughter had written for a library poetry contest. He watched the clock for some time. Students' heads bowed. The ladder in his throat rose and fell. He wandered in a fog, a body, a distant spine, the rapids widening around his ankles, binding him within a watery book. What held him? His coffee? His croissant with newspaper and radio? Who judged him? The chambers of his ears hollowed with the ocean. He thought of how each reading of a text is a rewriting of it, and how tired he felt, how there were gaps in his body that couldn't be filled by theory. He began to cross a bridge, speckled iron carapace, traffic and pedestrians passing in and out of its orifices through its lower levels of digestion. Then suddenly and inexplicably, he was in the vicar's parlor of his childhood. The stale air tinged with presumed goodness and knowledge, darkly lit, curtains, and a single mirror set between two small lamps above a bureau. He was never tall enough to see into that mirror, and he knew he never would be. Soon enough, the students would stop writing, and he would have to raise his head towards his reflection and listen.
That's my favorite piece in the entire book. I just want you to know.
Wow.
Yeah,
Really?
I just love that piece so much. I've already read it like 6 times. I just love it.
That's so fun to hear.
So what now?
That's so fun to hear. I wouldn't have ever guessed that might be.
Oh, well, where does it rate for you?
Oh, that's a hard question. Where does it rate for me? Maybe in the middle somewhere.
Ah, okay. That's interesting. Why do I love it so much? Okay, I love the way you have balanced it. So you have that piece about that line about the students gleefully passing judgment very early. So first you set the framing, the students in the room and they're doing the essay work, and you have that line about judgment. And then you have a little bit later, you have who judged him. Just this random line in the middle of his sort of start of his flight of fancy, who judged him. And, of course, you immediately go back to where the students are gleefully judging. And so you're like, okay, this is what this is about. So you get that signal that that's what the whole thing is going to be about. And then you go off into this guy's, in his mind is wandering, and you sort of go back with him and go into the scene setting that you have. And it's kind of like a dream. It's like, from these really dreamy places, and you get lost in that. Or I do, and I sort of forget about the whole judging thing. And then all of a sudden, you circle back at the very end. This is the thing that does most closely the kind of thing I was talking about, where you sum up the whole thing in the end, kind of like what Mountains did. And he's talking about how he'll never be tall enough to look into that mirror. And then he turns to the kids, to see his own reflection. That's the mirror. It reminds me a little bit of Tobias Wolff's short story, Bullet in the Brain, actually. Do you remember that story? You know that story?
I think I don't know that story.
Oh my goodness. You have to read that story. It's wonderful. Yeah, and it's pretty short. Bullet in the Brain. It's an amazing story. He's a critic. I can't remember if he's an art critic or if he's a critic of writing. I can't remember that piece, but he's a critic, and he's waiting in the line at a bank. And I won't tell you anymore, but Bullet in the Brain kind of gives you but it's interesting because it's like this meta kind of consideration, like you've done here, about, what are you devoting your life to? What this difference between being a critic and being an artist, and what is it, what's driving you? And in Bullet in the Brain, the guy is just kind of this really sarcastic, very judgy person. Anyway, you must read that story. And I mean, I just compared you to Tobias Wolff, so you have to feel great about that. But anyway, I just love this piece because of the way you've set it up and the way that you turn those expectations around at the very end. And I love what you said about doing the research. When I read it, I thought, oh, I wonder if this is a real guy. And I wonder if Jefferson read like an article or something about his doing this with his students. And I said, I refuse to Google him and find out if this is true. I'm just going to enjoy it as part of this piece. But isn't it wonderful when going down a rabbit hole brings you a whole piece, which, by the way, is another great thing about writing these really short prose pieces, because, it doesn't take that much of the rabbit hole, to give you a whole world, because you're only shooting for 500 words or 700 words or whatever it is. You can do this grand thing in this small space. So you get all the joy of the research, all the joy of the work, and then this lovely little thing just drops on the page. Pretty great.
Makes it sound so easy.
What'd you say?
It makes it sound so easy.
Well, it kind of is, no? You don't think so?
Well, I mean, I guess when it turns out right, it is. Yeah.
Well,
I feel
right.
like,
Well, I mean, we're not reading like the 300 that are on my computer. I said I published 25. I wrote a story a day, so
right.
Yeah. But for the good ones, for the ones that are successful, yes, they do just kind of drop onto the page, and it's delightful. And it's worth all that hard work, isn't it? It's worth all that sweat to get those 25 that came out like little gems.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's find, this seems like a good time to read this last one. So speaking, it's another one of those kind of world within a world pieces. It's called 4 Sentences on the Thankful Arnold House. Who Thankful Arnold was a real person, a woman who I don't remember much about her, but I think I probably was drew by her name, Thankful Arnold. And it's written in the voice of a portrait painter. And I think that's all I'll say about it. And that it's literally 4 sentences. 4 sentences on the Thankful Arnold House. I was commissioned by the East Lyme Historic Society to do a facsimile of the portrait of Thankful Arnold, which hung in Mrs. Dolby's living room, and which she was unwilling to sell to the Thankful Arnold House, who had opened as a historic museum 7 years ago, but lacked their matron's visage hanging in the foyer as it had in Thankful Arnold's living days. The project posed numerous problems for me, not the least of which was Mrs. Dolby's house, which I was required to visit in order to take the photos I needed to create the facsimile, and whose cats I was deathly allergic to, but who, if there was any other reason than Murphy's Law, I'll never know, failed to cease weaving furry figure 8s around my legs and leaving their long white hairs on every possession I brought with me. Mrs. Dolby herself puttered me into near oblivion with an onslaught of tea and passive aggression most palpably felt by her need, as I was attempting to arrange the lighting necessary for the photos, to cover me with a blanket of tissue-soft barbs, such as, "You have such beautifully well-loved boots. Do make sure they are clean enough to be on that rug." Or, "That vase next to your elbow is priceless, and I wouldn't want that twitchy little arm of yours to knock it over." The last major difficulty was Thankful Arnold herself, who, although the wife of a successful local merchant and known as a quiet seamstress among the locals of her time, possessed such an intensity within the aura of her eyes that, no matter how many times I tried, I was unable to recreate, for there was something truly unearthly about Thankful Arnold, something deep and powerful and more than a little unnerving behind her green eyes that upon first glance looked so gracious and receptive. But no, she held a ferocity in her I have never witnessed, and I have been a commissioned portrait painter all of my adult life.
Wow, I love that. So it's a great one to show your humor. Just for listeners, Jefferson often uses humor in his pieces, and I just want to congratulate us both. I just realized when you were reading this piece that we did a great job selecting your readings, because It sort of covers the gamut, right? Because you have quite a few pieces in there that hit hard, I feel like they're about mortality, just so much about death and darkness, but beautiful, and then then we had the piece that was sort of meta and very, in the head, and now we have the piece with the humor. So we did a good job selecting those pieces. I know Marcella's about to come back to lead us into the question and answer period. So I won't take too long, but I also have to chastise you as well as congratulate you for writing something in four sections. How dare you? We're always supposed to do 3 or 5. Those are the pleasing numbers, and you chose 4. Somehow it works, Jefferson, but don't do it again. That's all I'm saying. It's also so interesting to know that Thankful Arnold is a real person. I also wondered if I should Google that when I read it and wouldn't let myself. I am going to Google this one for sure after this, because I'm really curious, especially because they call her Thankful Arnold. Really?
Yeah, that was her name.
Really? That was her.
Yeah.
Oh my
goodness. It was
goodness.
a real name. Yeah, it was a real name.
That is so interesting. Okay, so I look forward to finding out more about that. But thank you for using putter in that way. That was great. And the tissues, barbs, that was great. All the humor. I just really enjoyed it. I don't have any questions about it because you explained it when you talked about it. I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed it. And I really do appreciate the humor. Do you like how do you feel about the dark things that you write against the funny things that you write?
Well, they seem so necessary to me. Like the humor really gives a little space to open it up. Like whenever I read that passage about the cats, I just think of their little tails swirling back and forth and getting hair all over everything, which is, kind of necessary in my world to have kind of humor. So yeah.
Yeah, and the passive aggression, those parts were funny, and it was such a surprise. Again, it was nice how you sort of subverted the expectations too, because you were in this place where you're sort of being kind of funny and a little bit distant, and we're just sort of picturing the scene, and then suddenly you get quite serious at the end, and sweet too, sweet in a good way.
I love the idea of this portrait painter who's like, in my mind, a real professional painter and isn't able to, like, there's something in Thankful Arnold which surprises him. Like there's knows what it is about this surprisingly complex, fierce lady that he can only gather all this from just looking at her eyes and the challenge of what he's going to try to recreate.
And he can never quite capture it, which, is also something so interesting. Whenever I go to a museum and I see the really, really good portraits, like, I don't know how they do it. Right? I have no idea. Like, why are some people, when they're both wonderful painters, why are some people able to capture the essence of a person and other people are not?
And the portraits that you see that are like technically good but didn't capture that are so obviously flat. It was almost like embarrassingly flat sometimes. But when you see a real one, you're like, whoa, that was it.
Yeah. See, I never in a million years would have thought of that as a subject of a piece. So amazing. Good for you. Wow.
Yeah, that was fun.
All right. Well, we are ready for questions and answers whenever
Great.
other people are.
Hello.
Hi.
So we do have some questions coming in here on Zoom, but also on Facebook. But just a reminder to our audience that if anyone would like to ask a question, we still have some time. So go ahead and type those in and we'll definitely ask them. So the first one here comes from Josh. And he says, this question is naturally broad, but short and subverted fiction doesn't tell story in the same way as longer forms. Rather than conveying plot, what do you generally want to be the end effect or result of short fiction?
Jefferson, you go first.
Okay, yeah, I just had the thought. That's a good question. Thank you, Josh, for that. I was thinking of the quote of Emily Dickinson when she says, "I know it's poetry if it blows the top of my head off," and like that's the sort of feeling that that's the goal that I would most love, and who knows if they happen, but to blow a portion of someone's head off, yeah, that's what I would like.
What a nice image. So the reason I definitely wanted you to go first there is because I don't know, but I suspect that what I want to accomplish with a short prose piece is similar to what a poet wants to accomplish with a poem. Because I want to deliver emotion, and I really, I mean, you cannot, like Josh says, you can't have a long narrative. So you're going for bringing across this whatever that deep thing is that you're feeling when you look at a mountain, or whatever that awe is when you're looking at that beautiful portrait. Somehow you want to get to that foundational idea that you're building on, and deliver the emotional punch that comes with it. Those moments that we all experience just living in the world, that's what you're trying to capture. It's what you're trying to deliver at the end, because you can't tell a story. You're just trying to create effect. And I guess that's what poets are doing. Is that right, Jefferson?
That's right, I think.
That's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Good. Great question.
So what books or I would say writers also would you recommend that speak to hybrid forms and very short fiction, in case people want to learn more?
So I would recommend the sudden fiction anthologies and the best small fictions. There are lots of anthologies for these shorter pieces. Those are my two favorite. There's also the guys who do sudden fiction also do flash fiction. Any of those anthologies are great. And some of them, I think they go back to the 70s, 80s, 90s. They were really big. And the best small fictions has been around now for maybe 5 years or so. It's been through a couple of different primary editors, and those are fantastic. So that's where I would go first for these short pieces. I'll think about some authors. Jefferson, where is for prose poems?
Let's see. Well, I would probably go back to the old Tales of Wisdom. That's my go-to piece. But those, I love those anthologies that you mentioned. I also love Diane Williams. I think she writes some of the best kind of short flash fiction prose poem things that I've read. And Sabrina Ora Mark also is someone who I really like. And then I also was going to show this book, Robert Walser, a Swiss writer from the early 20th century. And he is really good and very funny and really weird.
So I'm going to say Robert Olin Butler is really, really good for these short pieces. And then is it Abigail Thomas wrote Safekeeping? That's a wonderful, it's kind of a memoir in very short pieces. But I would really, there are several people who are great at these really short pieces. For some reason, one of my favorites is, the name is escaping me at the moment, but the best way to find people who are really great at this and that you particularly gravitate toward is to read those anthologies. And they're just bursting with great stuff. So that's where I would go.
This is a kind of a craft technical question. So if there's someone who's primarily writing in just poetry or just short stories or some other form, and they're intrigued, they've watched this program, you both inspired them, and they want to try it. How would you suggest that they actually start? How do they break free of habits and how they are used to expressing themselves? And what's step one?
That's a real good question. I think, what would I think one good, maybe step one would be to take a class, take a workshop. Claire teaches that micro fiction class, sometimes through the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. Other classes like that are a kind of a good springboard to widen your readership, like reading more widely, and then also practicing the art. I guess that would be one place to start. Claire, I don't know what you might think of.
I think that we can't underemphasize enough how important it is to read the form. If you're interested in a form, to just start gobbling it up. And again, find the authors that that you gravitate toward, that you like the most, and keep finding their work. Lydia Davis is also famous for her really short pieces. Um, and then just start writing your own. I mean, I really strongly believe in establishing a kind of writing practice for yourself, and not being judgmental about it, not letting the critic in when it's time to sit down and write, and just sort of teach yourself to write a little bit almost every day, and then find your way. You'll find your way. And absolutely take a class. I mean, I love taking workshops just to inspire me, and just to be in the same room with other people who want to write. Sometimes a couple of my friends and I talk about this a lot. Sometimes it's as much about building a writing life for yourself as anything else, respecting yourself and appreciating yourself as a writer, as somebody who just wants to create written work, and then making space in your life to do it. You don't have to do it every day, but almost every day, sit down and write a little bit. And then you'll take the class and you'll meet friends and you'll talk to them about it. And suddenly you have a writing life, and it's real to you. And you're reaching for those authors that you find inspiring. And then you find yourself, well, this author did this really cool thing. She wrote a series of things where she just used colors for each piece. Maybe I could do something like that. Maybe I'll write a series of pieces on holidays. And one day, out of the blue, you land on this amazing memory that you had completely forgotten from your childhood when you were 12. And it becomes this beautiful little perfect piece, and then that excites you and makes you happy, and you keep going. So I just recommend building a writing life for yourself that supports and respects the work that you want to do. And you'll start writing things that you love.
That's a great answer, Claire. Yeah.
Thanks.
Another viewer question. For subversion, do you set out to subvert a specific form, or does it begin with the story? A bit of both?
So when I write subverted form stories, no, I set out to subvert the form for sure. Like I find a form that I don't know what made me start doing that. It's just, I think it's because I was always like this dreamy kid. And, like I will read a recipe and I'll start imagining the people who are making the food and, where it came from. I'll read a shampoo bottle and I'll picture, a woman who's having a rough morning and, trying to read and the label's too small. It just seems like story just springs from everything, in every form I read, everything I pick up and I look at it, I start to think about what's going on in the margins. And the first one I wrote was a product label story, and it was about the label on a skin cream that's supposed to make your wrinkles go away, right? So it made me picture the kind of woman who desperately wants not to have any lines in her face, and what the product is promising in her, and what does that mean about her life. And I thought, okay, she's lonely and she's looking for someone, and maybe her coworkers think she's annoying, and you just immediately just start to develop story around it. And I built a story around all the promises of the product. In 2 weeks you will have beautiful fresh pearl-like skin. In 3 weeks you will look 10 years younger, and I just started creating all these other things that were happening in the woman's life around that. So yes, I definitely set out to take that form and discover the story behind it, the person that's behind the form. And you just start chipping away. Once you establish the form, you start chipping away at the stuff that's constraining you and building out the things that are story. And I mean, I've successfully done it a few times. I've had some of these published, but it's a tough thing because you're asking the reader to hang in there and read something that's kind of strange. It's never going to be for everybody, but I love writing. I still love writing them and reading them too. Thank you for that question. That was fun to answer.
I have just a quick answer to that, because I mean, it's interesting to think about where subversion comes from. And I was, as Claire was talking, I was thinking, like, I think that my kind of subversive instinct comes from my parents, who are both like pretty kind of, you wouldn't think that they are subversive people, but they actually are. Like there's quite a bit of like a kind of rebellion understreak. Like my mom was someone who got a ticket for parking out front of the YMCA and paid the ticket in a bunch of pennies, just like huge things, and brought them to the police department. I always remember that. And it's like, I think there's something that kind of runs in my family like that. And I think this is how it has taken up with me. I haven't paid any tickets with pennies yet.
But you will.
Yeah,
I can
will.
relate to that, Jefferson. That runs in my family too. So maybe that has something to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
We are at time. There are a couple of questions left. I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to get to, but I just want to thank you both for this delightful conversation, for wonderful pieces that you shared with us tonight. I personally think I'm going to head out and read some of these anthologies, as well as some of the work that both of you have read and more. So thank you both again for joining us tonight, for talking with everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.